Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first afternoon panel. A few more will join, but I wanted to make sure that we make the most out of the time that we have this afternoon. So to set the stage, as you may have heard, journalism as a business has had a rough couple decades. The collapse of the advertising model, nearsighted business decisions, and an influx of consolidations have depleted our national news corps. Between 2008 and 2017, US newsrooms lost 23% of their staff. And the digital media darlings, they have not been spared either, with large cuts at BuzzFeed and most recently, in the last 2 weeks, Disney writing off its stake in Vice, even as the fledgling video upstart bought Refinery 29. So beyond the noise of the M&As, the IPOs, and the user growth, there's a less told story about a resurgent local news movement, one that is going back to the first principles of journalism, cutting out the pork barrel, and centering the communities and the readers that their journalism is indispensable to. So the challenges are real, but so are the opportunities. And the City, Documented, and Chalkbeat, who we have here today, offer a powerful counterweight to the doom and gloom narrative you might have been told. And I think that they offer a glimmer of hope for what is to come. So with that, I would like to welcome Mazin Sidahmed, sorry, John Wotowicz, and Bene Cipolla. And I'm hoping that you can each quickly start us off by just introducing yourself and your organizations.
Great, yeah, it's fantastic to be here with you all. So I'm Mazin Sidahmed, I'm one of the co-founders of Documented. Documented is a single subject news site dedicated to covering immigration in the New York area. We launched in June 2018, and the real impetus behind launching Documented was me and my co-founder, Max Siegelbaum, found that after Trump's election, there was an intense focus on what was happening at the border and what was happening in DC. You know, two really critically important areas to focus on, but a lot of the policies that are happening in DC are first felt locally in communities across the country. And we thought there wasn't really an intense coverage of the changes to interior enforcement and the ways in which city and state legislatures were responding and kind of capturing what it means to live as an immigrant today in this current moment. So we launched in June 2018, and since we've started, we've had a lot of editorial impact with our work. We wrote about how state pension funds in New Jersey had increased their investment in private prisons that detained immigrants during the height of the family separation crisis, and our reporting actually led them to divest. A similar thing happened with the Canadian state pension funds. We've exposed collaborations between court officers in New York State courts and ICE, despite the fact that court officers claim that they've no communication between them. And our work has been cited in city council hearings a number of times. So we felt that as soon as we launched, there was a real need for our work, and the response has been great. And we're also dedicated to making sure that the people most affected by our stories are also the people reading them. Immigration reporting has a history of being quite extractive and taking a lot from communities without actually having a conversation with them afterwards. So we're dedicated to making sure that immigrant communities that we're writing about are also reading our work, and that's led us to a number of different avenues. One of the things, we launched a Spanish language newsletter on WhatsApp, because research showed that WhatsApp was one of the primary ways that Spanish speakers in New York were getting their news about immigration.
Hi, my name is Bene Cipolla. I'm the editor-in-chief of Chalkbeat. We are also a single subject nonprofit news organization. We cover public education. Because almost all education decisions are made at the state and local level, that is where we are focused. We are local first. We operate in 7 locations around the country: Chicago, Colorado, Detroit, Indiana, New York, Newark, and Tennessee. We also have a national desk that does a lot of work around education research and studies. They also kind of tie the local threads together and provide national context to the local stories. We were founded in 2013 as the merger of 2 blogs, one in New York and one in Denver. And that was kind of at the crest of the ed reform movement. So a lot of charter activity, teacher accountability, things were changing at the federal and state level. And we were noticing that it just wasn't getting covered because of the collapse of local news. And the education beat turned out to be one of the first beats to really get decimated in a lot of local and major metropolitan newspapers. The Commercial Appeal, for example, in Memphis, which is one of our bureaus, used to have 13 education reporters, which is stunning, right? Higher ed, K through 12, pre-K, operating not just in the city, but in the suburbs into Arkansas and Mississippi. They now have one. They have one education reporter. So we are filling a really critical void. Education is a very critical beat for many reasons, not least the future of our democracy. Like Mazin said, we believe that we report for and with communities, not on and about them. For example, we don't have an editorial page. We have a feature called First Person, which is trying to elevate voices that don't often get heard in regular mainstream media. So actual students, teachers, parents, not necessarily the big policymakers or those in power. We just launched a strategic plan a couple weeks ago that takes us through 2025. And our goal is to expand from 7 locations to 18. And it's really ambitious and pretty scary, but we are very confident, and we'll be asking for your help later to join our movement.
John, how about you?
Perfect. Hi, I'm John Wotowicz. I'm the publisher of The City. The City is New York City's new nonprofit, independent, local digital news platform. It's a lot of words, but each of them have meaning. Consistent with Kyle's comments and the entire panel, our genesis is the fact that this country has turned into a farm of news deserts at the local level. There has been this unbelievable mass exodus for lots of the economic and structural reasons that Kyle has articulated. And in New York City, most people assume that the media capital of certainly this country, perhaps the world, would be immune to that trend, but it's quite the opposite. In fact, conservative numbers, New York City has lost 270 local journalists in the last 7 years. And that's at a point where the city budget is larger than ever at $94 billion, and where the population is larger than ever and still growing. And obviously rife with issues, with challenges, with concerns within the city at large and within its populations. We launched 6 months ago. We were the brainchild of a small founding group led by Julie Sandorf, the president of the Charles H. Revson Foundation. Julie had seen, and Revson and Julie have been at the forefront of support and thinking around nonprofit news generally and local news in New York in particular. And seeing this chasm opening, Julie and Revson stepped in, and I was actually reached out to, along with a longtime friend of mine, John Thornton, who was the founder of something called the Texas Tribune, which was founded 10 years ago to solve a similar problem in Austin at the regional and local level in Texas. So we were called by Julie, who had already done basically all the thinking herself, but wanted to make sure that she brought others along with her really forefront thoughts on this. And so what we put together was essentially a Texas Tribune model, which looks a lot, for those of you who know these things, looks a lot like the NPR model. Where funding comes not only from large philanthropic sources, but also from individual members and from corporate sponsors. Luckily, because of her efforts, Julie was able to bring along 2 other major donors to us, Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the Leon Levy Foundation. Each of those organizations provided $2.5 million, so a total of $7.5 million as seed funding. And as those of you with a VC background know, that's a lot of money to have in your pocket as a unformed and new entity. it was really an imperative in all of our minds because New York is a big place, and we knew that we couldn't really move the needle on local news without a scale newsroom on day one. So we went out, hired an extraordinary editor-in-chief, Jerry Hester, who then put together a team of 17 other editors and journalists. So we launched on April 3, 6 months ago, with a, and this is a sad comment, the largest local newsroom in New York City, and the only newsroom that has beat coverage of all 5 boroughs. We've been publishing 3 to 4 stories a day now per month. So, we're approaching that 500 story number in only 6 months of operation. Our style is to deliver real news that has an impact and is relevant to the daily New Yorker's life, but to tell it in a, and I'll use Jerry's phrase, which I think is quite evocative, with tabloid style, tabloid urgency, but without tabloid excess. Namely, something that a New Yorker can read in 2 or 3 minutes, get it, and where that story is told in a way and with a narrative and with language that actually is engaging to read for those 2 or 3 minutes. And the final descriptive comment really involves our approach, which is very similar to all of the institutions represented on this panel. Yes, we are reporting the news, but we are reaching into the communities. We have a program called Open Newsroom in partnership with the Brooklyn Public Library System, which involves a series of 40 meetings at various locations in the system that have been already extremely successful at gathering local people in communities to make sure we understand exactly what's going on and what's at the front of those communities' minds. And that's as much a part of our ethos as is great reporting that hopefully captures you. We are growing. 2020 is going to be a big year. We are going to add to our smaller stories as you see them today with feature stories, likely with audio and some other elements of the picture.
So one thing that you all might start to pick up on, right, is this idea that we're moving into somewhat of a new chapter, right? None of these 3 orgs are around in 2010, right? So you're talking less than 10 years old, right? And when we talk about the tabloid urgency, but without the tabloid excess, you think back to a Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill, and this idea that newspapers used to literally fight for every single scoop, right? And I think that we're entering this new collective time where we are thinking about working together versus trying to fight over whatever scraps might there be, right? And so I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about how this idea of cooperation and how you pull on resources from different orgs to make your work possible.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I will because it's, sorry. There we go, great. I'll start because it's an easy lead-in and it hands off right to the rest of this panel. Our mission as defined by our funders is to lift the tide, not just our boat. And in fact, there is essentially a play well clause in all of our major funding. What does that mean? It simply means that we are being judged by how well we collaborate with other high-quality journalistic institutions. And one of our assessment metrics is how often we are republished, mentioned, or collaborate in joint production with those high-quality institutions. And 2 of these high-quality institutions with whom we have already done exactly that are on this panel, which was a nice coincidence, thanks to Kyle. I think, I'll kind of, that's a big setup to both of you to kind of talk about how you think about collaboration and a little bit about how we have collaborated at the city.
Yeah, this was one of our founding principles as well. Our content is free, and I don't just mean it's free on chalkbeat.org, it is free to republish. Any of you could grab our content as long as you credit us properly and run it on your own blog or media organization or Columbia, whatever. It's very important for us to reach as many people as possible because that's one way that we drive impact, and impact is at the heart of what we do. We measure impact by kind of measuring instances of what we call informed debate. How are we informing the conversation around public education? And also informed action. How is our journalism actually influencing policy and decisions that are made about education? How are we helping to solve inequity, a small problem, and ensure better outcomes for all kids in America? We have worked with the city, as John mentioned. We are undergoing an ongoing collaboration on special education and other education challenges. We have one of the open newsrooms coming up on the 22nd. If anyone would like to join, we'd love to have you. It's going to be at the Central Brooklyn Library. We are also doing something at an innovation summit run by an engagement organization called Hearken. So this is something that we're doing to really do outreach to parents and help inform the journalism, because again, if we are not listening to the community, we are not serving them. So you can read our work by Chalkbeat in places like the City. You can read us in the Indianapolis Star, the Detroit Free Press, the Denver Post, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is absolutely one of the core principles since our founding.
Yeah, I was just echo everything that's been said already. Like, partnerships is crucial and key to everything that we're doing. And I think it's hard for people outside of journalism to really understand how much of a culture shift this really is. Like, 10 years ago, the idea of, the Panama Papers is like something that you all might be familiar with. The idea of that many news organizations coming together and working together on something without conflict happening was just unheard of. People were not open to working together. There was a very zero-sum mentality. People viewed, any success that their competitors had as a loss for them. But we're in a completely different landscape right now, and young journalists that come and work with us, the first thing they want to do is partner with another news organization. That's kind of inbuilt in the mentality of organizations, and it's key to our work. Like, we've partnered with the City. That was a really involved partnership where myself and a reporter at the City actually reported out a story together, and brought our different areas of expertise to the story. But we also do partnerships where we feel like a partner can introduce us to another audience. So we work with The Guardian on a piece about the Canadian state pension funds that I mentioned earlier. That it was a story that was outside of our remit. We kind of just stumbled across the fact that the Canadian state pension funds had been increasing their investments in immigration detention during the family separation crisis. And we felt like we don't have a natural audience in Canada, whereas The Guardian does. So we came to them with this story, and it had tremendous impact and led to, protests in Canada, a bill introduced in Parliament, and eventually them divesting. So the value of partnerships is clear and evident, and I think we're in a completely different landscape right now that's a lot better.
So being in a business context here, because I think the community engagement, the journalism, the impact, unquestioned, check, 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 right? What I want to dive into a little bit more is the business side of this, right? And in as much detail as possible, I want to know, what is the operating budget? How much are you paying yourself? How are you making this work? How are we paying the electricity bills, right? Like, because these specifics, I think, matter, especially when you have a group of really smart, talented business minds, social enterprise minds who, this is on their mind. So if we don't talk about it, it's just not going to, right? So I want to kind of dive into that if possible.
So we have a budget of $12 million this fiscal year for 1920. That's a pretty big budget. It's a big budget for someone like me who comes from journalism. It's big for nonprofit news. We now have 60 people working at Chalkbeat. We are like the second largest, I think, nonprofit newsroom in the country, and we are going to be more than doubling in size according to our strategic plan if we hit our targets and raise $23 million in a growth fund. Again, we will need your help. But in all seriousness, I think the need is real for business people in nonprofit news, in local news. And I come from the journalism side. I don't come from the business side, but I have made it my business to learn about the business side. And I think that's another difference. You know, Mazin was talking about this shift in culture, which is so critical to the success of news going forward, that we are partnering with each other. It's also really critical that we don't have this kind of fake divide where journalists don't care about how their newsroom is funded. It doesn't mean that funders tell us what to do. It just means that we all should understand where the money is coming from. Chalkbeat is primarily funded right now by philanthropy. We also have an earned revenue team. So we have corporate sponsorships. A lot of that money is also kind of local, smaller companies funding newsletters, for example, or events. We also have a membership program that launched last fall. So some of our funding also comes from individual donors. Over time, we want to grow the piece of the pie that is earned revenue and sponsorships and members, so that we are a little bit less reliant on philanthropy. The other interesting thing about Chalkbeat is because we're operating in 7 different locations, we're not just relying on these massive national donors, right? We are actually looking for local family foundations that most people in New York haven't heard of, places in Denver or Memphis or Indianapolis, because that is most sustainable for us. And again, it goes back to the community, and if the community is bought into this, we are going to last, right? Because we get money from Gates and Walton, and we appreciate that money very much, but they're not necessarily tied to those local communities that we're operating in.
I'm the one business person on the panel in terms of background. As Bella said, I think the common trait is we're all business people now. But Kyle, your question, you know, we have a $4 million budget in our first year. One of the things that I was hyper focused on in kind of setting up our model was taking advantage of the fact that we live in 2019, not 2009 or before. And what does that mean? It means that in our launch year, which includes startup, setup, all the things that come along with starting a business and starting an enterprise, we've managed to keep overheads in total at 20%. That includes everything. So 80% of our $4 million is going to journalists and editors' salaries and benefits. Number one. Number two, I think we, from day one, conceived of ourselves not as, and I will borrow a John Thornton phrase because I think it's great, and it is something that afflicts much of the not-profit world in general, and certainly not-profit news, these organizations being, all 3 of us being an exception to this. You know, there is a tendency to think of yourself as a newsroom with a tin cup. And namely not to think of this as what it is, which is a diversified media and technology business. And you have to conceive of the model that way. You have to think about how you're designing your team and your competencies. You have to think about cost structures that way. And getting back to my 2019 point, the reason we're at 20% overhead is because there is so much you can do between SaaS platforms and outsourced competencies that 10 years ago you would have to build yourself. You'd have to staff up to continue to keep those things fresh. You don't need to do that now. And that means that you really can focus your funding and your energies on the thing that ultimately will define you and deliver on the mission, which is content. So all those things are incredibly important. My last comment is it's really interesting. When John and I went through the process, John Thornton 11 years ago now, in thinking about the Tribune, that process started trying to come up with a for-profit model for this regional local news engine that would be attractive for a VC investor. And as you all know, that means at least some prospect, I mean, let's forget 2X and all that nonsense, but some prospect of a recurring double-digit IRR. And we couldn't come up with one. And we kept coming back to this idea, yeah, you can get to a point of sustainability, but that's where you actually say if what you have is a business model that is sustainable, which in my mind means, you know, you are break even on a free cash flow basis, which therefore is very unlikely to ever deliver a equity-like return, then you're crazy not to be a not-for-profit. because at that point, you can take that same model, flip it to not-for-profit, and you have a de facto 35% government subsidy in the form of the charitable deduction that is a super cost of capital optimization tool. And so people tend to think of not-for-profit as a different model. Oh, well, that's not a optimized business. It's not a well-run business. It's not a business designed to grow and to deliver more than it consumes. That's absolutely wrong. It is simply a tax election. And it also gives you, when you get to the revenue side of this, if you are a mission-based organization, as we are, the fact that you are not nonprofit gives you, it is a stamp of legitimacy to the sincerity of that mission, because ultimately, the one missing piece, of course, is there's no return to a shareholder, and control is in a board who really are truly trustees and stewards of that business, as opposed to folks trying to optimize a financial return. And getting back to my kind of penultimate point, if you're in a model where there's not going to be any return anyway, why chase that, right? And why give up the opportunity to have this very, very advantageous funding structure?
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think that that mentality needs to kind of be understood within the current private sector within journalism. I think that a lot of people see going for profit as giving up or accepting that there's no path towards sustainability in journalism, and I just don't think that's the case. Our organization is much smaller than my two colleagues over here. We're at a budget of just a few $100,000, and it's me and my co-founder, and we pay ourselves just enough to pay rent in New York, basically. But we do feel like, as a single subject news site, there are a lot of opportunities. We have the most loyal section of our readership of people that work on immigration professionally. So we have a lot of people that gravitated towards us straight away that are immigration lawyers, immigration advocates, immigration policymakers, all kinds of people across the spectrum who touch on immigration in a number of different ways, and we have a really keen understanding of what their needs are. And we're developing products, just the two of us, with the help of partnerships that we've built with the engineering school here and at Rutgers and other places that will really service the needs of these communities. And we think that over time we can turn these things into something that we could pay a nominal fee to use, or could even be an avenue for us to leverage donations or support from different professional communities. But as it stands right now, we're very reliant on philanthropy. The philanthropic space for news is still nascent, I think, if you compare it to other areas of philanthropy. But it's growing. There's a growing understanding of the value of investing for a social impact group or a foundation, of the value of giving a nonprofit news organization philanthropy money, and the role that we play. And also just an understanding that within the news industry that it doesn't necessarily corrupt your mission if you take philanthropic money, that there's an understanding of what news does and the necessity of us being independent and how that helps everybody in the long term.
I want to echo what Mazin said about the niche audience and the potential there. I think all of us have this kind of niche audience, whether it's the niche city, right? People are obsessed with where they live, or it's immigration, or it's education. And we have different audiences within the broad Chalkbeat audience. Some are teachers or those who work in the classroom, whether you're a paraprofessional, a counselor. We have what we call insiders, so those people more in decision-making roles, like a legislator or a charter management executive, parents, of course, students, and those we call curious citizens, people who are simply interested in education, even if they don't have a dog in the fight. Part of our plan going forward is, how are we diversifying all the revenue streams? So I mentioned sponsorships, for sure, and membership, but we're also thinking about different kinds of content that can help fund the news business. So can we create more kind of lifestyle content that we can find bigger sponsors for than, a daily school board meeting story? Probably yes. So that's one way that we are thinking about the future in terms of how can we pay for this going forward. can we think about different content models to support the news side?
So we've hinted at this, but I would like to hear what you think the alchemy of a successful nonprofit local news org in 2100 looks like and how it's different than right now.
100, damn.
Because that's the goal, right? Like we need to be around in 80 years if this is going to work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to get through the Trump administration and then like see that, yeah. 10 years. But I think the thing that a lot of people are aspiring towards right now is just a healthy mix of reader revenue, which is kind of what we would say is membership plans, you know, readers supporting you in different ways, maybe going to your events, philanthropy money, so what we've spoken about extensively here, and then some kind of targeted specific thing. And historically, that would have been a jobs board or a classified section in a newspaper, but now it might be something more along the lines of like a product that you're building specifically for news organizations. A lot of private news organizations like the Washington Post are building content management systems and selling them to other news organizations. So like, news organizations kind of becoming tech companies in their own ways. I think that would be a good thing for the future. And obviously ads, yeah, people still sell ads.
I'm just going to say ditto. Quoting John Thornton again, who co-founded with our CEO Elizabeth Green something called the American Journalism Project, which is a venture fund for to fund local news. I think he said 40 to 50% is kind of where we think the sweet spot is in terms of the makeup of philanthropy funding a local news organization. That's what we're ultimately aiming for. I do want to say, like, this is a public good, and it should be funded as such. John also mentioned Julie Sandorf at the Revson Foundation. She's been a real leader in this, and I think is starting to galvanize more of a movement. Our CEO likes to quote that I think the ballet sector is like $1 billion sector, and that's a lot of money. And I support the ballet. That's wonderful. No disrespect to the ballet. But local news philanthropy is like 1/10 of that, and I think we can do better, and we should be thinking of it as truly a public good in this country.
And quickly, John, before you go, how do we reclaim that narrative, right? Because there's a narrative around the ballet that there isn't around local news. How do we promote that?
Well, it kind of dovetails to my answer to your last question, Kyle, which is, you look at all sorts, everything kind of swings as a pendulum. And, to use a completely unrelated analogy, if you look at the tech world and especially delivery of the technology, the swing between, centralized and distributed processing, it just goes like this, right? You'll see these super-powered device, and then everyone decides, oh, well, let's just take it all from the cloud, and then the network breaks down, and you go back to the device, and it swings. And I think we're seeing a similar swing, or we have seen a similar swing in news, right? News is something that people trusted an editor, trusted a name, trusted an organization. That's where you got your news. It was kind of a centerpiece, and then all of a sudden, a series of things happened, both in terms of the breakdown of trusted edited work. And so for some very good reasons, people said, look, this is all nonsense. Let's go to, I want to get it the way I get it. I want to get it directly. I just want to hear from people. I don't care if it's edited because I don't believe the editor, and I don't mean that as a specific personal thing, the organization. And I think what we're now seeing, and we're not down here yet, it's going back in this direction, because people, they're overloaded by primary information, if you want to call it that. We have this phenomenon now where you just simply don't know if something is trending. Fundamentally, 90% of that traffic can be either people who they don't say they are or bots. A friend of mine is on a big public company board. They had kind of a big event negative event for the company on a PR level. And very interestingly, they brought in a huge crisis management team. The old days, a crisis PR team was all spin doctors and people who'd make phone calls and write deft copy. Half of this team were developers. And they went down the rabbit hole of trying to trace all this traffic. And without getting into the minutia, the conclusion delivered to the board of this company was that 90% of the traffic around this event, this incident, was bot. And when you get into that world, you really see all the structural underpinnings of a swing back toward trusted edited content, where you can look at people like this. I'm not the editor. You know, my colleagues here are, where you can actually know who's doing the editing, where you know who the reporter is, where you can make some assessment and look to third-party sources, like in the not-for-profit world. Who are the philanthropic supporters of this, and are these the blue-chip folks, not because of some nonsensical reason, but because they know the most and are the most discriminating as to where they put their money, and use all those indicators as a place, as a way to figure out who you're going to read. So I get to your comment about this future view. I think, you know, whether it's 2100 or because of how fast the cycles move these days, that's 2050, I do think we're moving back in that direction. And I don't say that for some sort of happy, optimistic view. It's because of all the structural things that I just laid out.
Wonderful. So before we open it up for questions, I want to, and we had talked about this, you know, before the panel, but there's a lot of great business minds, you know, here in this, both this building and this institution, in this room. So I'd love to hear a 90-second elevator pitch of what types of business minds you're looking for, and then also why you. John, should we start with John?
Yeah, sure. Oh, no, I can go ahead. Yeah, listen. We need you. We're in a crisis right now in terms of the way that people trust journalism and the kind of threats to the institutions of journalism. But it's also a huge opportunity, and it's an opportunity to do things that are innovative, to do things that change norms, and to have a dramatic impact on the democracy and the future of this country. Documented is a fantastic news organization. We break stories and are working on one of the most important issues of our time. And we would love to work with some of the brilliant minds at this institution.
We like to think that we're reinventing local news. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to talk to you. Like I said, we are thinking about ways to diversify our revenue streams, including these kinds of different content models. We've called it the Mars mission, which sounds, I think, pretty exciting. MARS stands for Mission Aligned Revenue Stuff. But the acronym works so well. And if you would like to join our Mars mission, please come talk to me.
You know, I spent my professional career up to this point in the for-profit world, most of it in financial services. I was an investment banker for 20 years. Helped run a large asset manager for 5, did a lot of private VC and fintech-related investing after that. My passion all along, as an avocational matter, was news. You know, as I mentioned, I was a founding member of the Texas Tribune board. I was an NPR member station board, and about a year ago, I just termed out after 2 terms, 6 years on the NPR Inc. board in Washington. Was vice chair there, finance committee chair, and chaired the CEO search committee once ago that brought in another for-profit veteran, a guy by the name of Jarl Mohn, who ran E! And Liberty Digital for John Malone, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I'm kind of peppering all that, and I'll refer back to John Thornton, you know, this is a place for great business minds. I have fully utilized everything that came from a law degree from a place that I can't say I have fond memories of, but it served me well, around the corner here at Columbia, and then you know, a lifetime in the for-profit world. I'm finally getting a chance to make my avocational passion my vocation, and every element of my business skill set is getting tested here and challenged. It's not a layup. At all. And the full company experience from everything from legal to accounting to controlling to revenue to content management to tech. You know, all of these things, they're in full reveal, and if there is another and last element here, I would make the argument that a well-run nonprofit is going to give a better experience to someone who really is looking for that than a for-profit, because if it's well-run, it's lean. And what that means is, you know, there is a ton of responsibility, there's a ton of opportunity, and by the way, if you're funded by some of the folks we are, if you're thinking about a network effect, the network that you develop around these sorts of high-quality philanthropic and corporate sources is extraordinary. You know, head-to-head with anything else that's out there, and I've seen most of it, so, you know, come on in.
Well, I'm sold, but I want to hear from you all. We got a couple mics, and just raise your hand, and we'll get you a mic, and we'll keep it going.
Thanks very much. I was just wondering if you could the pendulum swing I think is really interesting, because I remember 10 years ago with Patch and AOL and thousands of journalists were going, oh my God, this is it, local. And then all of a sudden it's kind of belly up, or I mean, there's still like 120 Patch journalists now from 1,000. But I was just wondering, because you talked about, you know, local and trust and all of that, but everybody was, you know, on the bandwagon for a couple of years, and then it just cratered. And it was all about trust too, because it was after the Iraq War and Bush and all of that. So, where how is this going to be sustainable? As I look around for local news and all of that, like, because we've seen this happen again and again, and about trust, and if you can just talk about that, because it's fascinating just listening to this. I'm like, we've been here so many times before, and why is it now going to really take off?
In addition to that, we're still in a period of disintermediation of media. So you're still competing against, you know, every mom and pop putting up whatever they're putting up on the internet.
I'll take the Patch AOL thing first. I don't think Patch built any kind of relationships in the communities that they were working in or continue to work in. Patch runs our stuff sometimes, and again, like our content's free, so I'm happy that they republish it. I did not ever see a Patch journalist like doing open newsroom. We do something called office hours, where we just post up in a coffee shop or at a community organization. We do reader call-outs all the time, asking what are your questions, what do you want to know? In Chicago, there's probably going to be a teacher strike, so we got about 60 people to write in and ask what they wanted to know, and then we just ran a story. Hey, here are answers to your questions. I don't think that was going on at that sort of hyper-networked AOL Patch level. This is like a really different for and with community kind of approach that the three orgs here are trying to undertake. And again, I think there's a mission quality that had been lacking before that I think does help build trust.
Yeah, I would also say on your point, the Patch model, DNA Info is an incredible organization as well, and Patch model with building scale to kind of sell as many advertisements as possible across the board has kind of just been proven now as like, is not really where media organizations want to go. And I think that we've gotten to a place where people realize that the best success, I think the publisher at the Times was saying this, that you have to make journalism that's good enough that people would want to pay for. And the idea of this kind of like people moving towards building quality journalism and listening to people and having a deeper relationship with readers is a shift, I believe. I think that the Patch model was a bit more cynical than what we're experiencing right now. And on your point, I do think that what we're experiencing now in terms of, you know, the competition that may be between somebody posting on Facebook and kind of being in that content milieu. We're in this kind of post-election moment right now where there is a general public appetite for high-quality journalism. I think I was at The Guardian during the election, and I saw the membership plan that was rolled out at The Guardian right before the election, how people just flocked to it right after Brexit and then right after the US election, how people flocked to it. And the ask was really for nothing. You know, they was saying, we make great journalism, it's very expensive, we're struggling, will you give us money? And a lot of people responded. There was a lot of skepticism internally. People did not think it would succeed, but it was a testament to me that there is genuinely a shift in understanding of the importance and value of journalism.
You know, I think all of the above, plus, look, the fact that these organizations and others that look like us are being run as businesses is a big difference. And Bella talked about kind of the absurd divide that really persisted until, you know, very recently of, oh, no, I'm a journalist and you're...
still persists in a lot of legacy...
in many places, in legacy places, exactly. That's new, and that is a new thing, and the fact that you have 3 people from such diverse professional backgrounds and from organizations that have 3 different target groups in terms of audience, but are saying exactly the same thing about the essentials for success. You would not have this 10 years ago. And I think if you overlay that on the fact that there is also this much more intense development focus on these 3 or 4 different streams of revenue, membership, you know, I'll just use a quick NPR example because it's relevant to all of us. Corporate sponsorship revenue at NPR, at the NPR Inc. level, has gone from 30 million to 120 million in 5 years. And it's because in all of this kind of sorting out of what's the audience you want to reach, people are figuring out that that's the audience, that is the audience that matters. And I would argue, interestingly, that our audiences are actually, versus NPR, and the lightning bolt may come down and hit me for saying this, are actually more attractive on many metrics. And I won't get into you know, what those are for just to be polite. So I do think that there are structural changes. I think there are philosophical changes. I think there are cultural changes that all support this thing having some legs. Does that mean it's easy? No. And it's hard work, but I think what it all comes down to, and this is my last point here, with no disrespect to, we're all pulling in the same direction. I don't care what title or name you put out there. Everyone's trying to, you know, deliver something of value. You have to have the very, very, very best editorial, meaning editors and reporting team, because ultimately it's all about great content. And I don't mean great, you know, you think about programmatic ad buying. I promise I won't go down this long, but programmatic ad buying with what are called blacked out keywords ultimately results in an organization who's trying to get big programmatic ad buys, homogenizing and essentially dumbing down their content, because that's what the programmatic buy instruction on the algorithm drives. And so we're all focused on members, we're focused on engagement, we're focused on community, and these are all the things that give you the hope and the possibility of creating a sustainable ecosystem, because you know who your readers are and you are able to involve them and engage them not only as readers but as supporters.
My name is Peggy Kim, and just want to thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation. It's interesting because I also came from the broadcast side of the business, and you know, after a certain point at 9/11, I just stopped watching broadcast news, and so now I'm consuming NPR. But I wanted to ask about 2 separate things. One was about partnerships and how you all work together. And what do those partnerships actually look like? Are there financials changing hands, or is it bartering? Is it marketing? What is that? And then the other piece is going to the points that you've been making about whether, I'm wondering from what you're saying, is the nonprofit journalism model the one that's going to survive in 2100? And is for-profit journalism pretty much, going to be the dinosaur?
I'll speak to the partnerships first, and I'll speak to our partnership with the city. No money has changed hands at all. I don't think any of our reporting partnerships has included money. We are not against it in the future. I mean, I could see a world in which maybe we co-fundraised for something, right, to fund a particular project or something like that. Also could see a world in which we threw an event with another organization and we got sponsorship money, and we're both trying to, we're both putting on the event, so we both get some of that sponsorship money. But generally how the reporting collaboration works is, again, we're not competing, right? There's plenty of pie to go around. So the city had a database. They had put out one of these reader callouts that we often do as well, asking parents about their challenges with the special ed system in New York City. The city, because they are awesome, reached out to us and said, hey, you want access to these answers? We'd love to partner with you and increase our reporting manpower. So we now have one of our reporters, the city has a reporter working on this. We do co-reported stories, we also do our own stories, and we republish each other's stories. And then we are doing this event together on the 22nd as part of the Open Newsroom to talk to parents in person. And then that feeds back into the coverage for both of us. So that's one example of a collaboration.
I'll just comment on the dinosaur aspect. Look, I think it all gets down to the definition of news, and it's hard not to go down. It's hard to go down that road and not get kind of preachy and self-righteous, and so I won't. But look, there's all sorts of stuff, to use the last piece of your Mars.
It's a technical term.
Exactly. I'm using it as now, since it's a great term of art. There's all sorts of stuff that we are interested in consuming every day, and I don't think that something that may, let's just say, be more entertaining than informative is a bad thing. I think it's, we should have well-rounded lives and we should be well-rounded people. I think when you drift toward content that I think hopefully, and we certainly all have an eye to our content being engaging and interesting, not just the kind of thing where you try to read it when you go to sleep and you're out in 30 seconds. That does not do anyone any good. So we're certainly trying to make what we do engaging. But ultimately, we still are trying to convey some very specific, very defined, what we think is very important information. And I do think that as you skew to that side of what quote-unquote news is, I do think you are going to see the continued growth of this not-for-profit model, and they'll look to public media, radio and TV, and PR, and as a continued validation of that. But I think that the opportunities for us, with not burdened by what those organizations have, they are legacy organizations. I think it's a bright future for all of us, and I think you'll still see a lot of very vibrant for-profit things that are more toward the entertainment side of that spectrum.
And just one first principle to synthesize is that there's this idea of like the indispensability test, right? Is what you're producing indispensable to somebody? People pay for things that are indispensable. Philanthropies engage with nonprofits who are indispensable, right? And so Patch was never indispensable to anybody. And so I think when you think about just that test and when you look at content, NPR is indispensable to a large amount of people, and that's why they're still thriving, at least in partial.
Quick thing, we have actually been paid for some of our partnerships. When we work with big national news outlets, we did a partnership with The Times. They paid us like a nominal fee, and we're doing a partnership with like an audio outlet that's kind of paying us sort of like as an institutional freelancer. So we've seen it somewhat as like a revenue stream as well. So yeah, there's like a mixed bag on that.
And we also we're developing an MOU for our partnerships to just get on the same page about who's editing what, who has final say, what's the copy flow like, things like that sound really boring, but they're very critical to producing good content.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
I think at this point in time, I don't think democracy is deepening, right? There has been a real shift on choosing more authoritative leaders around the world. So how do you see yourself thriving at a time when there is a lot more influence from the public, like from the government side, especially with journalism being the fourth pillar itself?
I think because of that trend, a lot of people see the value in journalism now. I think a lot of people that are worried about that trend and concerned about it have realized that a lot of the success of authoritarians and the rise of fascism has come at the same time as the decline in journalism and the rise of misinformation. So in some ways, the backlash to that has kind of hardened the resolve and woken people up to the importance of journalism, in my view.
Yeah, I would say it's never been more important because the value of the press, right, is in holding the powerful accountable. And part of that is simply showing up and listening, recording what people are saying and doing. And if there's none of us to show up, then we're in trouble.
I mean, look, none of us are, and pardon me if I'm, please raise your hand if I'm wrong, none of us are government funded. And I think that, honestly, public radio and public media in general have struggled a little bit with that there is still a portion of funding that comes from the government. It's 20% in the context of the public radio system overall. Those systems have worked very hard and I think successfully to kind of bring that percentage down, but we started zero. And I think honestly, in this day and age, these models are much less prone and susceptible to being swung, by political forces per se than the for-profit models are, for a whole host of reasons.
See, our last question goes to whoever has the mic right now.
I have the mic. My question to you is this: since your publications have all come to being, say, since 2010. Did I hear him say earlier? Have you had the ability to develop diversified staff? And if not, how are you meeting that challenge?
One of the reasons I wanted to start a newsroom is because I was every newsroom I worked in was all white. I was one of the only black people in pretty much every newsroom I worked in. And I was just sick and tired of it and the problems that it creates. Consistently having to explain to editors why certain communities are worthy of coverage. So it's the kind of the impetus of why I started this newsroom. I haven't had the ability to hire a huge team, but it's key to everything that we do, and I see it as partly in who you hire, but also in the way you approach journalism, the way you listen to people, the kinds of stories that you rise up and the kind of voices that you include in your pieces. You have to think about all of those things when in your reporting. And it's the whole philosophy behind what we do at Documented.
I'm really glad that you asked that question. The press in this country has historically been white male dominant and totally inequitable. And we have to do better. We have to change that. Otherwise, we're not telling the full stories. It's awful. We have set goals for us around diversifying our staff, and we have made progress over the past several years. We also want to do better. So some of our goals this fiscal year is to diversify our board and our leadership team. We are currently hiring for a chief people officer. If anyone's interested, application closes in 10 days. But that is kind of a rare thing in a newsroom, to have someone dedicated to the people part of the organization. We started a diversity, equity, and inclusion, we call them action forces at Chalkbeat, earlier this year. That's just volunteers from the organization who are committed to advancing DEI at Chalkbeat. And we are working with an outside firm on this. It's core to our strategic plan. In fact, if you want to check out chalkbeat.org, we have our 5-year strategic plan there. And DEI is like one of the pillars of that, because if we don't diversify both our staff and our board, we aren't telling the right stories. We know that.
So we made a big part of launching the city with a diversity survey as part of the launch, visible launch pages on our website. You can go on and see that. We mapped that, and the comparisons that we made on that page were to the New York demographic. I would say, and I don't want to sound satisfied about this, but I think we launched in a very good place. And you can just see on the bars the distance we think we have to travel at the staff level. Similarly, our board today, I think, is moving very nicely, has launched and is moving very nicely in the right direction. There's some steps left to go, but I think honestly, and I'm saying this as a white male, I did not want to be part of a leadership team at an organization in New York City that could not actually stand up on day one and have legitimate data to point to say that this is certainly versus the industry, a material demonstration of commitment on day one, and a really great place to build from. So yes, absolutely, and we're hiring too. We're hiring a director of communications and marketing. We're hiring somewhere between a director and an associate director of development. We are going to be looking ultimately to hire a associate publisher that, I'll just be super blunt, is my hope that they will take my job. It is certainly our hope, and it is stated in all those postings, that those hirings at the leadership level will reflect the diversity of the city.
Wonderful. Well, I saw a bunch of hands, which warms my heart, but wanted to just thank everybody here.